I think that, all of us are trying to understand the world better all the time, and one of the things that we are trying to understand about this particular book is communism and why anybody would advocate communism. I mean, maybe in this day and age, that's a really, a good question for young people. There was this thing called communism. It's been abandoned by just about everybody. Why did anybody ever believe in it? A document like this, Communist Manifesto, is good, if only because it intrigues our historical curiosity, our sense, how different things were at a certain time. And certainly, communism is a kind of thing everybody talks about, and no one knows what the heck they're talking about. But not that I do either. But Marx and Engels are very helpful in this sense. If we look at section 2, a couple pages into it, we get a good definition, a good thumbnail definition of what communism is. They say, in this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Now, why is that key? Why is that the central aim of the communists? The abolition of private property. If we go back to the beginning of the work, the notion that history of society is the history of class struggle. That class struggle is a struggle over resources and a struggle over what is needed to live and a struggle over wealth. And it is, of course, also built into it is exploitation of the labor of one class by another, and this goes through all societies and all class struggles. In the Middle Ages, the aristocracy was exploiting the labor of the peasants. The slave societies in the ancient world, the slave owners were exploiting the labor of the slaves. In modern capitalist society, the bourgeoisie is exploiting the labor of the proletariat, but how do they do so? That is, it's a relation of dependence. It's a relation where one class is dependent upon the other. The lower classes are depending upon the higher classes. They have to come to them and strike a deal. In order for the lower classes to live, they have to sell their labor. And what is it that allows for that exploitation? It's private property. They continue, we communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's labor. But they're saying, what does private property allow the one who owns it to do? It's to get the fruit of another man's labor, another person's labor. They ask a little bit later on, but does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital. That is, that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. That is, if one owns the means of production, factories, the capital that creates modern businesses, then one has social power, because those who don't have capital whose only alternative is to sell their labor for wages, have to come to them, have to come to you if you have it. You then hire that person in a wage labor contract. And their labor, they're compensated to some degree, of course, in wages for their labor, but the point of their labor is that their labor grows capital, that their labor adds value and wealth to the capital of the owner of the organization, and that's their whole reason for being hired in the first place. And so that capital is a form of social power. It says a little bit later on, to be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal, but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, and here we can invoke Adam Smith, the idea of the division of labor, nay, in the last resort, only by the unified action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not a personal, it is a social power. And, that is two things in Smith come up there. One is the division of labor, social labor, creating something, division of labor, cooperative labor, creating wealth. The other is his idea of the value of money. I mean, that is labor being the source of all value, and also wealth being simply the power to command labor. The very idea there is very similar, I think, some ways to Marx, the idea that wealth, or capital, is a social power. That is, ultimately, what is wealth? It's the ability to command labor. So it's a kind of a social relation. And the more wealth you have, the more labor you can command. So the very idea of money, as I think I said in that earlier talk on Smith, is that it involves us in social relations. Immediately they have ethical connotations. What is the ultimate upshot of private property in a capitalist context? It allows for exploitation. It allows for the situation where the world is turned on its head and people are treated like things and things are treated like people. So the very dramatic part, a little bit later on again in section 2, says the average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, that is, that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. Wages will only be sufficient to keep the laborer alive, and most of the fruits of the laborer will go to increase capital. He says, what therefore the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. Yes, there's a really explicit invocation of the kind of thing that Smith was talking about. You know, the society that Marx and Engels are thinking about is one in which there's no surplus that any individual has that they could use to exploit anybody else, that everybody would just get what they needed and no more. In terms of material goods, or at least there would be no such thing as capital. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. Accumulated labor, again, being capital. You know, if the source of all wealth is labor, then the value of any commodity, of money, of anything is merely the labor that went into it. So capital is that accumulated labor. So in bourgeois society, living labor, that is the human being, is but a means to increase accumulated labor, capital. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. That is, accumulated labor, capital, dominates the present. That is, the living person. I, as the worker, am oppressed by capital, oppressed by the past, in the sense of past labor has gone into things to make capital, and I am now dominated by that capital, by that private property. So the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. That is, there is no capital. So accumulated labor is just used by living beings to better their lives. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality. That is, capital, money, wealth, is treated like a person, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality, as people are treated like things. There's much more to go into. There's much more to this work that we could go into, but let's just leave it there. I mean, it gives us a kind of touchstone, again, a kind of theoretical resource here. Because what Marx and Engels have said, basically, is that the core of modern business is rotten. That the core, the essential element, private property, which is the institution where one person is allowed to own something and say it's theirs exclusively and can use it for whatever they want. The private property, in the form of capital, is really only good for one thing, and that is for exploiting other human beings. So the very core, again, of capitalism and therefore of modern business practices is rotten, and the whole notion that somehow we can bring in ethics and that the business person can humanize the business practice is a kind of a cruel joke. It's the worst sort of propaganda, and it's just a papering over of the reality, which is that business practices are about treating people like things. And at the bottom of every business practice is the exploitation of labor. So why the heck are we here, you might say? So I think it's the last sort of touchstone that we have for this course, the socialist, communist, or Marxist sort of view of the framework within modern business practice, and a certain view of the validity of the very notion of business ethics itself.